The Bible talks about a particular subject that many of us tend to minimize. We don't think it's that important, and that's the subject of our tongues, or the words we say. And I'd like to look at James chapter 3. James starts out in chapter 3 saying, "Don't be in a rush to become a teacher, my friends. Teaching is highly responsible work. Teachers are held to the strictest standards." And he begins this little subject of the tongue in chapter 3 using this illustration of a teacher and how teachers are held to higher standards, stricter standards, and we shouldn't rush out to be one. And the reason for that's kind of obvious to me is that teachers use their tongue more than most of us. Teachers talk a lot, say lots of words, and the more they say, guess what? The more chance there is for them to say the wrong thing. And it's not just teachers, same with you and me. The more we talk, the more chance is that we're going to say things that are hurtful and can cause problems. He goes on to say, in this verse, by the way, I never noticed this before, but this really is profound in that it shows how important this area of the tongue is. He says, none of us is perfectly qualified. We get it wrong nearly every time we open our mouths. If you could find someone whose speech was perfectly true, in other words, you could find a man or woman who was really able to control everything that he said and only right words came out of his mouth, then you'd have a perfect person in perfect control of life. In other words, this person who used God's grace and wisdom and used that to control his tongue would also be able to draw from that same grace and wisdom for other areas of his life, and there would be no problem with it. So that's how important it is to have a handle on controlling the words you say. He goes on in the next 3 verses here and uses 3 little illustrations of small things that have powerful consequences and abilities, and they're very powerful. He talks about a steel bit that goes in a horse's mouth. He talks about a rudder of a great ship, and he talks about a little spark. A bit in the mouth of a horse controls the whole horse. You ever stand beside a big 1,000-pound horse and try to scoot him sideways? You can't do it. But you put a small little steel bit in his mouth with the reins on it, and just a gentle pressure one way and he turns left, a gentle pressure the other way he turns right, or a gentle tug backwards and he stops. He goes on and says in the next verse, a small rudder on a huge ship. You know, ships can weigh up to 70,000 tons, today's ships, and yet this small rudder, compared to the size of the ship, is able, in the hands of a skilled captain, is able to set the course and guide this ship even in raging storms and strong winds. He then says in the next verse, the same thing with your tongue. It's small, but it's very powerful. A word out of your mouth may seem of no account. I mean, after all, just one little word, all I said was blah, 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 whatever it is. But God says it can accomplish nearly anything or destroy it. It only takes a spark, remember, to set off a forest fire. That's how powerful it is. Just like one little tiny spark kindles some straw, lights the little twigs, lights the branches, and pretty soon you have a raging forest fire. And he says a carelessly or wrongly placed word out of your mouth, or mine, can do the same thing. By our speech we can ruin the world, turn harmony to chaos, throw mud on reputations, send the whole world up in smoke and go up in smoke with it, smoke right from the pit of hell. This is scary, God says. You can tame a tiger, but you can't tame a tongue. It's never been done. The tongue it runs wild. It's a wanton killer. Thinking of tigers and taming them, and Siegfried and Roy, 2 men who were able to tame and train actually Bengal tigers and use them in their act in Las Vegas. There's been other animal trainers who trained huge, gigantic elephants to do tricks and had bears dance with people. But with our the tongue is unable to be tamed. He says, with our tongues we bless God our Father, and with the same tongues we curse the very men and women he made in his image. Now, maybe you've not gone around cursing people lately, but have you been to church ever and had a great sermon, sang great hymns, fellowship with your brothers in the Lord, and then gone out of the church at the end of the service, gotten in your car, backed up, and the guy behind you backed out of his parking space at the same time and almost caused a wreck. Or maybe he did bump you. Well, with our tongues, we bless God our Father in the church, and with the same tongues, we curse the very men and women he made in his image. He goes on to say, cursings and blessings out of the same mouth. My friends, this can't go on. A spring doesn't gush fresh water one day and brackish the next, does it? Apple trees don't bear strawberries, do they? Raspberry bushes don't bear apples, do they? You're not going to dip into a polluted mud hole and get a cup of clear, cool water, are you? And these are all rhetorical questions, and the answer is obviously no, 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 and no. In the book of Colossians, in the 4th chapter, there's a verse 6, that says, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. I did a little study on this a long time ago, and we don't have time now, but salt, seasoned with salt, I think has the lesson of salt and its properties. Salt tends to lift up. It's buoyant. You get in salt water and you float. Salt also preserves things. Salt also can heal. It has healing properties. So a speech that lifts up and heals and preserves, that's the kind of speech God's speaking about here. And he says that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Now he's not saying, he didn't say that you may know what to answer. He said that you may know how you ought to answer. And I think that oftentimes how you say things is far more important than what you say. And when Donna's in another room and asks me a question, I always holler out real loud back to her the answer. And she said, why are you so mad at me? Why are you talking like that? I said, talking like what? I'm just talking loud. No, you're talking mean. You're irritated. And so it is important how you say things, not what you say so much. Proverbs, same thing, confirms this same thought here. A soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stirs up anger. And there's so many verses in God's Word about the tongue and the words we say. We looked at James 3. In the 1st chapter of James, he says, therefore, my beloved brothers, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. When we're all done, I want you to look in a mirror, and you'll see 2 eyes looking back at you. You'll see 2 ears listening, and you'll see 1 mouth ready to speak. That's not an accident. That's just exactly the way God made us anatomically. In the book of Proverbs, God says the one who knows much says little. An understanding person remains calm. Just the opposite of what we as people who know a lot tend to do. If we know a lot, we want to tell people. We like to hear ourselves talk. Another proverb says, even dunces who keep quiet are thought to be wise as long as they keep their mouths shut. Even dunces, idiots, morons who keep quiet are thought to be wise. Proverbs also says, watch your words and hold your tongue and you'll save yourself a lot of grief. The book of Ecclesiastes, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. So if it's such an important area to control, and if it's an area that once we do get some control on it, it even affects the rest of our life, but it also is true that God says no man can tame the tongue, how can we get victory in this? Well, there's a hint in the book of Galatians. Paul says by walking in the Spirit and yielding the fruit of the Spirit and not the works of the flesh. And we might do as the psalmist does and pray, Lord, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight. And I always like to think of, there's a proverb, a psalm that says, post a guard at my door, at my mouth, God, set a watch at the door of my lips. And I've often pictured a man with a watch in front of his mouth. And that little picture has helped me and remind me that God can put a guard or a watch in front of my mouth and guard the words that come out of it. So let's be the kind of people who ask the Lord to protect us and the things we say and to have good words come out.